The train rolled across the endless Texas plains like a mechanical serpent cutting through an ocean of grass, carrying within its rattling carriages men who had crossed an entire ocean only to find themselves prisoners in a land so vast it seemed to mock the very concept of confinement. They sat in silence, these German soldiers, their uniforms still bearing the dust of North African deserts where Rommel's dream had crumbled beneath the relentless sun. Their hands rested on their knees, calloused and uncertain, the hands of men who had expected iron shackles and found instead the peculiar American tendency to treat war as something that could be paused, put aside like a book marked for later reading. Hans Muller pressed his forehead against the warm glass and watched the landscape unfold with a dreamlike quality that made him wonder if the fever from his wound had returned. He had been a schoolteacher in Hamburg, a man who spoke to children about Goethe and mathematics, and now he found himself part of this strange procession into the heart of America, this country they had been taught to see as decadent and weak, yet which had swallowed their armies whole and transported them across the Atlantic as if moving chess pieces on a board too large to comprehend. The grass outside stretched to the horizon in waves of gold and green, and somewhere in that vastness, he had been told, they would work not in factories or mines but on ranches, herding cattle like the cowboys in the American films that had been banned but secretly watched in Berlin before the war consumed everything. The other men in the carriage maintained their silence with the discipline of soldiers who had learned that speaking too much or too little could be equally dangerous. Werner sat with his arms crossed, his face set in the same expression he had worn at El Alamein when the British tanks had come through the smoke like prehistoric beasts. He had been a butcher's son from Munich, and the irony of being sent to work with cattle was not lost on him, though he kept this observation to himself. Karl, the youngest among them at 19, stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, these hands that had loaded artillery shells and now would hold what, rope? The reins of a horse? The concept seemed absurd, plucked from a fantasy that had no place in the grim arithmetic of war. When they arrived at the camp outside a town whose name sounded like something invented by a drunk cartographer, the sight that greeted them defied every expectation they had carefully constructed during the long journey. There were barracks, yes, but they looked more like the temporary housing for migrant workers than the prisons they had imagined. There was wire, but it seemed almost apologetic in its placement, as if it were there more as a suggestion than a serious barrier. And there were the Americans, these guards who walked with a casualness that bordered on the comedic, some of them barely older than Karl, chewing gum and smoking cigarettes and looking at the new arrivals with something that resembled curiosity more than hatred. The commanding officer was a man named Captain Morrison, lean as jerky and weathered by the Texas sun until his face looked like a relief map of the territory he governed. He addressed them through an interpreter, a German-American from Pennsylvania whose accent made the prisoners wince, but his words carried a strange pragmatism that cut through the formal military language they expected. They were here to work, yes, but not in chains. They were here to tend cattle on the surrounding ranches because the war had taken the young men away, and the beef still needed to reach the soldiers fighting overseas, including, and here Morrison paused with what might have been humor, the ones fighting against Germany. They would be paid, though in scrip usable only at the camp store. They would have food, shelter, and medical care. And they would learn to be cowboys, whether they liked it or not. The absurdity of it settled over them like dust. Hans found himself assigned to a ranch owned by a man named Clayton, whose father had come from Texas before it was fully Texas, when it was still a place where Mexican, Anglo, and Comanche territories overlapped in complicated patterns of conflict and cooperation. Clayton was 63 years old and had buried his only son 2 years earlier at a place called Guadalcanal, a name that meant nothing to Hans until he saw the way Clayton's jaw tightened when he mentioned it. The old rancher looked at Hans with eyes that had seen too much death to waste energy on hatred, but too much loss to offer easy friendship. What passed between them in that first meeting was not warmth but a mutual recognition of necessity. The first day on horseback, Hans discovered that his body, trained for marching and combat, knew nothing about the strange dance required to stay atop a living creature with its own opinions about direction and speed. The horse, a mare named Peaches for reasons Hans could not fathom, seemed to sense his incompetence immediately and treated him with a mixture of patience and disdain, like a governess assigned to an particularly dense pupil. Clayton watched from his own mount with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been gas. It was hard to tell with American faces, and offered corrections in a drawl so thick Hans needed several seconds to translate each instruction in his mind. The cattle moved across the land in patterns that seemed random until you watched long enough to see the logic beneath the chaos. They were creatures of habit and hierarchy, and learning to move them required understanding these invisible rules, reading the way a bull held his head or a calf stayed close to its mother. Hans, who had spent years teaching children to see patterns in numbers and literature, found himself applying the same observational skills to animals whose vocabulary consisted of lows and body language. Werner proved surprisingly adept, his butcher's understanding of bovine anatomy translating somehow into an intuition about their behavior. Karl struggled, his youth and nervousness making him rush when he should wait, pull when he should release. The days bled into one another with a rhythm completely unlike military life. They woke before dawn to light that turned the eastern sky purple and gold, colors Hans had forgotten existed in the gray years of war. They ate breakfast that seemed designed to supply enough calories for manual labor and heat that made the desert campaigns seem mild by comparison: eggs, bacon, bread thick with butter, coffee strong enough to double as paint thinner. Then they rode out to wherever Clayton needed them, moving cattle between pastures, checking fence lines, pulling vehicles from mud, tasks that were simultaneously simple and complex, requiring strength and patience and a willingness to solve problems that had no elegant solutions. The landscape worked on them in ways they could not articulate. The sheer scale of it, the way the sky dominated everything else, the sense that you could ride for days and still be on the same ranch, it fundamentally altered something in their understanding of space and possibility. In Germany, in Europe, everything was close, packed tight with history and borders and old grievances. Here, the land seemed to actively resist meaning, to shrug off human attempts to organize it into neat categories. The grass grew and the cattle ate it, and the seasons turned with an indifference to human concerns that was almost peaceful in its completeness. They learned the vocabulary of this new world slowly, painfully. A lariat was not just a rope but a tool with its own grammar of loops and throws. A cutting horse was an animal trained to anticipate the movements of cattle with an intelligence that sometimes seemed to exceed that of the rider. Branding was not a symbol but a necessity, a way to mark ownership in a place where ownership itself was constantly being negotiated with nature. And the cowboys themselves, the real ones who had been doing this since childhood, were not the romantic figures from films but men whose bodies bore the accumulated injuries of a dangerous profession, whose hands were permanently shaped by reins and rope, whose silence often masked a dry humor that emerged in unexpected moments. Hans began to notice things about Clayton that complicated the simple narrative of captor and captive. The old man rose before any of them and worked longer, his body bent by arthritis but still capable of tasks that would exhaust men half his age. He was fair in a way that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with a rigid code of conduct he applied equally to himself. When Hans made a mistake that cost them half a day's work, Clayton's response was not anger but a calm explanation of why it mattered, delivered in that impenetrable accent while they ate lunch in the shade of a mesa. When a storm came through and lightning struck near the herd, scattering them across miles of rough country, Clayton assigned Hans to his side during the recovery operation, a gesture that Hans understood meant trust, or at least the absence of active distrust. There were moments of unexpected grace that pierced through the routine like light through clouds. A morning when Hans watched a calf being born, the mother lowing softly while Clayton's weathered hands guided the new life into the world, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight since before the war. An evening when Werner sang a folk song from Bavaria while they sat around a fire during a night watch, and one of the American ranch hands joined in with a harmony that should not have worked but did, their voices rising into the vast darkness above. A day when Karl finally managed to rope a steer on his first throw, and the whoop of joy that escaped him was so pure and unguarded that everyone present smiled despite themselves. But the war was never truly absent. It lived in the letters that arrived irregularly from the Red Cross, bringing news from home that was months old and carefully censored, words from mothers and wives and sisters that had traveled across an ocean and through bureaucratic hands before reaching them. Hans learned that his apartment in Hamburg had been destroyed in a bombing raid, that his sister had moved to the countryside with her children, that his mother asked if he was eating enough, a question so absurd in its maternal normalcy that he laughed until Werner asked if he was all right. The news from the fronts filtered through in fragments: the invasion of Normandy, the retreat through France, the names of cities falling like dominoes. They were watching the collapse of everything they had been told was invincible, and they watched it from a place so removed from the conflict it might as well have been on another planet. Clayton's relationship with the war was more complicated. His son's death had hollowed something out of him, but it had not made him cruel. If anything, it had refined his understanding of waste, of the specific way young lives were spent for abstractions that looked noble from a distance and senseless up close. He never spoke directly about his son to the prisoners, but Hans saw the photograph on the mantel in Clayton's house during the one time he was invited inside to use the telephone after his mother's health declined. The boy in the uniform looked impossibly young, his smile wide and innocent, frozen in a moment before the world taught him what war actually meant. Hans thought of his own students, boys not much younger than Clayton's son, and wondered how many of them had died in uniforms on the Eastern Front or in the ruins of German cities. The mathematics of it were too terrible to contemplate for long. As spring turned to summer, the work intensified. The cattle needed to be moved to higher pastures, a process that involved long days in the saddle and nights sleeping rough under stars so numerous and bright they seemed like a rebuke to the darkness humans inflicted on each other. During one of these drives, a storm rolled in with the speed that was typical of the plains, transforming the sky from blue to black in minutes. The cattle spooked, and in the chaos of trying to keep the herd together, Hans found himself cut off from the main group, alone with a dozen panicked steers and no clear sense of direction in the wall of rain that had turned the world into a gray blur. He spent an hour trying to keep the animals from scattering completely, using everything Clayton had taught him about reading their behavior, positioning himself to guide rather than force, and slowly, impossibly, managing to keep them roughly together. When the rain finally eased and he could see more than a few feet ahead, he found Clayton sitting on his horse 100 yards away, watching. The old man rode over slowly, water streaming from his hat, and studied Hans for a long moment before nodding once and saying, "You'll do." It was the highest praise Hans had received in years, and it meant more than he could have explained to anyone who had not spent months earning it. The other prisoners were dispersed across different ranches, but they gathered on Sundays at the camp for what passed for recreation: cards, conversations, letters home, the weekly ritual of collective existence that helped maintain some sense of continuity with their previous lives. Carl had been assigned to a ranch closer to town and reported that his employer, a widow named Mrs. Henderson, treated him with a mixture of suspicion and desperate need, her husband having died of a heart attack the previous winter, leaving her alone to manage land and cattle she was still learning to understand. Werner worked for a consortium of 3 smaller ranchers who shared resources and prisoners, and he described a world even more foreign than Hans's, where the employers were Mexican-American families whose relationship with the land went back generations, whose Spanish-inflected English he found easier to understand than Clayton's drawl, and whose cooking introduced him to flavors that made German food seem aggressively bland by comparison. They spoke carefully about the war's progress, aware that the guards listened even when they pretended not to. The news from Europe was increasingly dire from the German perspective, the Russians advancing from the east, the Americans and British from the west, German cities being reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns that made the earlier raids seem like practice. They had all been raised on narratives of German superiority, of destiny and blood and iron, and now they watched those narratives collapse in real time while they sat in Texas learning to castrate calves and mend fences. The cognitive dissonance was profound, and each man dealt with it differently. Werner became quieter, more withdrawn. Carl, paradoxically, seemed to bloom, his youth allowing him to adapt more easily to this new reality. Hans found himself in a strange intellectual space, simultaneously horrified by the destruction of his homeland and unable to summon the nationalistic fervor that had once seemed so natural. Summer peaked in temperatures that made work possible only in the early morning and late evening, with the middle of the day spent in whatever shade could be found, time passing slow as molasses while the land baked and shimmered with heat. Hans learned to read the sky like text, understanding which clouds meant relief and which meant trouble, how the wind shifted before a storm, the way animals behaved when the weather was about to turn. He learned that silence was not empty but full of information if you knew how to listen. The sound of cattle moving through grass, the call of hawks, the distant rumble of thunder that might be hours away but was definitely coming. Clayton began to teach him things that seemed to have nothing to do with ranching and everything to do with living in this particular place. How to find water by watching where the birds went. Which plants could be eaten in an emergency and which would make you wish you had starved. The locations of line shacks and emergency supplies scattered across the vast property. Hans initially assumed this was just Clayton's way of passing time, but gradually he realized the old man was transferring knowledge, ensuring that someone would know these things after he was gone, and the fact that this someone was a German prisoner of war seemed less important to Clayton than the preservation of information itself. The isolation worked on all of them. Away from the rigid structure of military life, from the constant reinforcement of ideology and hierarchy, they began to change in subtle ways. Hans noticed it first in Karl, who started adopting American mannerisms almost unconsciously, the way he walked, the gestures he used, even fragments of English slang creeping into his German. Werner remained more resistant, maintaining a stern German bearing that seemed increasingly like performance, a way of preserving identity in the face of forces that threatened to dissolve it. Hans found himself somewhere in between, aware that he was being changed by this experience but unsure whether to resist or accept the transformation. There was an incident in late summer that crystallized something Hans had been feeling but could not articulate. A young steer, favored by Clayton for breeding purposes, got tangled in wire fence and thrashed itself into a panic that resulted in deep gashes across its chest and legs. Hans happened upon it during a routine check and immediately rode back to get Clayton. Together they spent hours working to free the animal, stop the bleeding, clean and dress the wounds. It was brutal, exhausting work, the steer fighting them despite their efforts to help, and by the end both men were covered in blood and sweat and thoroughly exhausted. Clayton looked at Hans across the now sedated animal and said, "Your people bombed London. Killed plenty of folks who never did nothing to nobody. But that don't change the fact that this animal needs help, and we're the ones here to give it." It was not forgiveness or absolution, just a statement of fact, but it contained within it a philosophy that Hans found more convincing than any political ideology he had been taught. Autumn came late but decisively, the heat finally breaking and the air taking on a crystalline quality that made distances seem both closer and more defined. The work shifted to preparing for winter, moving cattle to lower pastures, ensuring feed supplies were adequate, repairing structures that needed to withstand the coming cold. There was a particular satisfaction to this preparation, a sense of working with natural rhythms rather than against them, that Hans had never experienced in his previous life. Teaching had its rhythms too, the academic year unfolding with predictable patterns, but this was different, more fundamental, connected to survival in a way that grading papers never was. News reached them in November that the war in Europe was entering its final phase. The letters from home became more desperate, describing food shortages, constant fear, the sense that everything was collapsing. Hans's mother wrote that she was living in the cellar of a friend's house, that the city he had known no longer existed, that she prayed for his safety and hoped the Americans were treating him well. The guilt of being safe while his family and country suffered was enormous, but it was complicated by the undeniable fact that he was indeed being treated well, that his life as a prisoner in Texas was materially better than the lives of most Germans at that moment, and what did it mean that his captivity had become a refuge? Clayton fell ill in December, nothing serious but enough to keep him in bed for a few days while Hans and the two American ranch hands who worked full-time kept things running. Hans found himself making decisions about cattle movement and resource allocation, using the knowledge Clayton had spent months transferring, and discovering that he could do this, that he had absorbed more than he realized. When Clayton recovered and came out to inspect the work, he grunted approval and said nothing, which Hans had learned was high praise. That evening, sitting on the porch of Clayton's house drinking coffee and watching the sun set over land that stretched forever, the old man said, "War's gonna end soon. Don't know what happens to you then." It was the first time either of them had directly acknowledged the temporary nature of their arrangement, and neither seemed to know what to say after that, so they sat in silence and watched the light fade. Winter brought a different kind of hardship, cold that was not as extreme as German winters but was somehow more penetrating, cutting through clothing with wind that had traveled across endless flat spaces. The work continued with different challenges, ice on water troughs, animals needing extra feed, the constant vigilance required to ensure nothing was lost to the cold. Hans learned to break ice with an axe at dawn, his breath visible in the air, his hands going numb despite gloves, and found a strange meditation in the repetitive physical labor that required no thought, only endurance. Christmas at the camp was a strange hybrid affair. The prisoners were allowed to organize a celebration, combining German traditions with whatever American accommodations could be arranged. They sang carols that sounded different in this place, their German words rising into the Texas night, carrying memories of homes that might no longer exist. Carl cried openly, homesick and young and overwhelmed by the gap between where he was and where he thought he would be. Werner remained stoic, but Hans saw the tightness around his eyes and knew the butcher's son was thinking of family and traditions and a world that was dying in fire and rubble while they sat in safety. The guards, surprisingly, joined them for part of the evening. Not in an official capacity but as humans acknowledging a shared moment of vulnerability. Captain Morrison gave a short speech about peace on Earth and the hope that next Christmas would find everyone home, wherever home meant by then. Someone had acquired whiskey, and it was passed around with a generosity that would not have been possible earlier in their captivity. An American soldier from Montana taught them a song about a lonesome cowboy, and they reciprocated with a drinking song from Bavaria, and for a few hours the fact that they had recently been trying to kill each other seemed less important than the fact that they were all young and far from home and tired of war. January brought news that Germany was collapsing, that Soviet and American forces were advancing from both sides, that the end was inevitable. The prisoners received this information in a group meeting, and the silence afterward was profound. They had known it was coming, but confirmation was different from speculation. Hans thought about his students, his sister's children, all the young Germans who would inherit a defeated, occupied, fundamentally altered country. He thought about the ideology that had promised greatness and delivered destruction, about how thoroughly they had been lied to, and about his own complicity in believing and perpetuating those lies. Work on the ranch continued because cattle did not care about geopolitics. A calf was born during a cold snap, and Hans stayed up all night in the barn keeping it warm, feeding it from a bottle because the mother had rejected it. Clayton found him at dawn, exhausted and cold but the calf alive, and the old man's hand on his shoulder felt like more than approval, it felt like recognition of something earned through effort that had nothing to do with nationality or war. In February, as if sensing the approaching end, Carl tried to escape. It was a half-hearted attempt, more existential crisis than actual plan. He made it about 30 miles before being picked up by local police, hungry and confused and unable to articulate what he thought he was accomplishing. When he was brought back, Captain Morrison's response was not anger but a weary disappointment, and Carl's punishment was restriction to the camp for 2 weeks, no ranch work. Carl returned to Mrs. Henderson's ranch chastened and oddly relieved, having tested the boundaries and found them real but not malicious, a containment that was also, strangely, a protection. Spring came again, the land transforming with wildflowers that turned the prairie into an impressionist painting of purple and gold and red, colors so vivid they seemed artificial. Hans had been in Texas for over a year, long enough that his body had adapted to the climate, his hands had developed the specific calluses of ranch work, his mind had adjusted to the rhythms of this life. He caught himself thinking in English sometimes, directly rather than translating from German. His dreams were set in both Hamburg and Texas, past and present blurring together in ways that would have troubled him earlier but now seemed natural. The news reached them on a Tuesday in early May. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. They received this information standing in the yard of the camp, the sun warm on their faces, birds singing in the cottonwood trees, and no one knew quite how to react. Relief mixed with grief, freedom tainted by uncertainty. They were no longer soldiers of a fighting nation but prisoners of a defeated one, and what that meant for their future was unclear. Some men wept. Others stood silent. Werner laughed, a single sharp bark of sound that contained no humor. Carl looked lost. Hans felt a weight lift that he had not fully acknowledged carrying, the burden of being part of something he had grown to recognize as evil, even if he could not yet fully articulate that recognition to himself. Clayton said nothing about the surrender when Hans arrived at the ranch the next day, just pointed at work that needed doing and rode out to do his share. It was only at the end of the day, when they were unsaddling horses in the barn, that the old man spoke. "You worried about going back?" he asked, and Hans realized he was terrified, not of punishment or hardship but of returning to a country that would be unrecognizable, of trying to rebuild a life from the rubble of everything he had known. "Don't know what's there anymore," Hans answered honestly. Clayton nodded, understanding in that nod more than words could have conveyed. "Well," the rancher said slowly, "work here don't care about politics. Cattle still need tending. Offer stands, if you want it. After all, the government business is sorted. Probably couldn't pay much, but it's honest work." And there it was, extended not as charity but as recognition of competence, an offer of continuity in a world that had become discontinuous. The weeks that followed were strange, suspended time between one life and the next. The prisoners were still held, the bureaucracy of repatriation grinding slowly through its processes. But the atmosphere had changed. They were no longer enemy combatants but displaced persons, a category that somehow allowed for more humanity than the previous designation. Hans continued working the ranch, teaching Carl techniques Clayton had taught him, passing on knowledge the way it had been passed to him. Werner talked more, the silence that had enveloped him lifting as the pressure of an uncertain future resolved into a merely difficult one. They made plans that were really just dreams, returning home, finding family, rebuilding, starting over. None of them mentioned that starting over might mean something other than returning to Germany. In June, Captain Morrison called Hans into his office and informed him that Clayton had officially requested his employment once the repatriation process was complete, that there were programs being developed for German POWs to remain in the United States if they had sponsors and employment, that it would take time but was possible. Hans walked out of that meeting in a daze, the prairie spreading before him in all directions, and felt the weight of choice settle on his shoulders. Return to a Germany that existed now only in memory, to family and language and a culture that was his by birth. Or stay in this strange land that had made him a prisoner and then, somehow, offered him a kind of freedom he had not known he was seeking. He wrote to his mother, letters that took weeks to arrive and weeks more to receive replies. She was alive, living with his sister in a small village, surviving but broken by the war's aftermath. She said she understood if he needed to stay away for a while, that things were very difficult, that perhaps it was better he was safe in America. She said this without knowing about Clayton's offer, and Hans heard in her words the permission he had not known he needed, the release from an obligation that would have been harder to honor than to abandon. The summer passed in a cascade of decisions and paperwork, interviews with officials who seemed unsure of the rules they were applying, forms that multiplied like weeds. Werner and Carl chose to return to Germany, Werner to search for his family in Munich, Carl because he was young enough to believe he could rebuild. They said goodbye on a hot August morning, promises to write that they probably would not keep, acknowledgments that they had shared something important even if they could not define it. Hans watched the truck carry them away toward the train station and felt the loneliness of having made a choice that separated him from everything familiar. Fall came again, and with it a finality. Hans's status changed from prisoner to immigrant, a word that carried its own weight of history and meaning. He moved his few possessions from the camp barracks to a small house on Clayton's property, a place that had housed ranch hands before the war and would again house Hans, now as an employee rather than a prisoner. The legal distinction was clear, but the lived reality was more continuous, the same work on the same land with the same person, yet everything fundamentally altered by the change in categories. Clayton never mentioned his son again, but Hans noticed small things, the way the old man taught him repairs to the ranch house using techniques he said he had shown the boy, the casual mentions of when I'm gone that implied a future in which Hans would continue this work alone, the inclusion of Hans in decisions about purchasing cattle or planning rotations that suggested a partnership rather than employment. They were not father and son, could never be that given the history between them, but they were something, some new relationship forged in the specific circumstances of war and its aftermath. Years would pass before Hans could fully articulate what had happened to him in Texas. He had arrived expecting change and found instead an invitation to participate in life that had nothing to do with politics or nationality and everything to do with the practical necessities of living in a harsh but beautiful place. He had been defeated in war but offered dignity in work. He had lost his country but found, somehow, a home in the last place he expected. The cattle still needed herding, the land still needed tending, and the work was its own form of freedom, the kind that came not from the absence of constraints but from finding meaning within them. On cool autumn evenings, sitting on the porch with Clayton while the stars emerged in their impossible numbers, Hans sometimes thought about the course of events that had brought him from a Hamburg classroom to a Texas ranch, the series of choices and chances and historical forces that had resulted in this specific moment. He thought about the students he had taught and wondered what had become of them, about the home he had left and whether it was still standing, about the family he had not seen in years and might never see again. But mostly he thought about tomorrow's work, about cattle to be moved and fences to be checked and the endless tasks required to maintain life in a place that resisted easy habitation. He had expected change and found instead something more complicated: responsibility, purpose, and a strange kind of peace that came from living close to the land and far from the ideologies that had nearly destroyed his world. The war had ended, but its consequences would echo through the rest of his life, and he would spend those years trying to reconcile the person he had been with the person he was becoming, one day of honest work at a time.